Welcome to EB-5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB-5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shaw, and other attorneys at Mona Shaw & Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB-5 Investment Voice.
Hey, Mona. I'm really looking forward to diving into this episode. Why don't you tell everyone what we have lined up?
Well, today we have something a little different, still EB-5, but today we're moving to a political track because we are focusing on lobbying in EB-5 and really what's going on in DC, because it's become so important and so crucial to the whole EB-5 world.
That's right. I'm always curious how the whole lobbying thing works. I realize everyone wants their language in there. They want to protect others as well as look out for their own interests, some more so than others. And, really, how do you navigate all the waters on the hill up there? I certainly don't know. Mona, you might have a better idea than me, but you're not an expert, right?
I'm not, but we have experts on the show. I would like to introduce, in fact, it's our pleasure to introduce Akin Gump from DC.
That's right. From Akin Gump, we have Hunter Bates and Han Christopher Rickhoff. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you very much. This is Hunter Bates speaking, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity to be part of this podcast today. And I can give you a little bit of background on Akin Gump. Akin Gump is a large law firm that has 20 offices around the world. And we also have the largest lobbying presence in Washington, D.C. I am the co-chair of the Public Law and Policy Group, which is our lobbying group at Akin Gump, and I'm proud to have with me Hans Rickhoff, who is one of our top lobbyists at the firm.
Wow. Hunter, can anybody do lobbying? If I decide tomorrow that I just want to go down to DC, can I lobby, or do you have to have a special registration?
Well, lobbying is the basic right that is mentioned in the Constitution, the right to petition. To be a lobbyist, the most important qualities are understanding the process, the players, and the policy for what's going on in Washington. And typically that requires you to have worked in government to sort of better understand the policy and the process, but it's certainly not a requirement. But to do lobbying, you do have to register under what's called the Lobbying Disclosure Act with the clerk of the House and the clerk of the Senate, and then file quarterly reports indicating what lobbying issues you worked on.
Interesting. Well, today we are talking about lobbying EB-5, but I do know that there are other immigration bodies who regularly lobby. How did your law firm become involved in the EB-5 realm?
Sure, Mona, thank you. And this is Hans. We first got involved in the EB-5 realm in 2011 when there was an authorization that was pending. At that time, EB-5 had broad support across the Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. You had the chairman of the Senate committee at the time, Chairman Leahy, a strong supporter, and he had seen positive impacts in his home state of Vermont of the EB-5 program. You had Chairman Smith on the House side, who was also a supporter of the program. You also were at a point where the I-526 petitions were only reaching about 5,000 or 6,000 a year, so the program was not at capacity. There were also a lot of members of Congress and their senior staff who are not as aware of the EB-5 program as they are today. But in 2011, it was certainly a different time than it is right now in 2018 in the new Congress. And we have both a new chairman in the Senate and we have a new chairman in the House.
Well, that's certainly true. 2011 was a different era. And I can tell you 2008, we have a lot of guests who are from that era, was a different era again. I do understand that EB-5 is difficult, and I understand that the people down at the Hill really don't understand it. Has that been your experience?
Well, I think the biggest challenge with EB-5 immigration reform, yes, EB-5 is a complicated area, and it's one where there is not a ton of expertise on Capitol Hill naturally, but the two committees of jurisdiction certainly have a great deal of expertise, and that's the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I think the Gordian knot, if you will, on EB-5 reform really focuses on trying to have a consensus between urban interests and rural interests. it is less of a Republican versus Democrat issue and more of trying to find the sweet spot between urban regional centers and rural regional centers. And you see that play out as well, whereas the chair of the House Judiciary Committee is Bob Goodlatte of Virginia, representing more of a rural area. And then you have the Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman, Chuck Grassley, which represents Iowa, and that is obviously a rural state as well. So those two chairmen both bring a strong rural perspective to that.
So with all the differences between urban and rural, there must be different lobbying groups, Hunter. How many different lobbying groups are there for EB-5?
There are several regional centers have hired their own lobbying firms, and then you have a few different trade associations or coalitions that have hired lobbying firms. So I don't know the exact number, but I would say it's safe to say there are 7 or 8 lobbying firms that are engaged in trying to get a long-term reform and reauthorization package over the goal line.
Do these groups all target the same people?
Well, at the end of the day, on an issue like this, really the committee of jurisdiction is where people tend to focus, and on the House and Senate leadership. So there is a handful of key players on EB-5, and it ranges from, on the House side, the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte. On the Republican side, on the Democrat side is Jerry Nadler of New York. On the Senate side, it's the Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley from Iowa, and then Dianne Feinstein of California, but also Senator Pat Leahy. Vermont is very important. Chuck Schumer, who is the Democratic leader in the Senate, is a strong advocate. And then Senator John Cornyn of Texas also plays a very key role in this discussion.
Wow. Well, with so many different lobbying groups then, because you mentioned several RCs have their own lobbying group, I think it is really important that each organization does have representation.
Well, certainly it helps to amplify your voice, to have representation. The other thing I think that's important is there are certain rhythms with the government process, with the Senate and the House. There are times when staff is very happy to have a conversation about the topic, and then there's times when they really have other things or other priorities happening at the moment, and they're not as interested in having a conversation.
Well, Hans, let me ask you this. You've mentioned you've worked with, several of the Senate offices and various staffers. And you also talked about how their interest somewhat ebb and flow with regard to EB-5. Sometimes they're very interested. Sometimes they are obviously working other priorities. But are there some offices among those that you listed that seem to either be more receptive or easier to work with regard to EB-5?
I wouldn't say it was necessarily a question of what offices are easier or harder to work with as it relates to EB-5. And in terms of how interest in EB-5 kind of ebbs and flow, I would focus more on, as the program has matured, as the program has grown, and as the program, frankly, has seen more press and many parts of that press being negative, that's when you see additional congressional interest. You also see significantly more congressional interest anytime you get close to a sunset of the program. And many times you see a flurry of activity right before that sunset to try to find some sort of reform package to move forward. And as we've seen several times since 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, that's been unsuccessful. Many times after a considerable amount of time has been put in by many of the staff that have been working on the issue for some time, and many of the members, primarily from the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, as well as members that have a strong constituent interest or also sit on the Judiciary Committee, there's inevitably some frustration after there isn't any ability to find a kind of reform package that's acceptable to all the members in Congress, all the members on the committee, and all the stakeholders. And so typically kind of what we've seen in recent years after that process kind of is unable to build a consensus and put anything on any moving piece of legislation, we see the Senate and the House taking an interest in the EB-5 program, primarily through the lens of the need for reform. And so in 2016, we saw Senate and House hearings on the program. We saw members of the Senate come all the way over to the House, which is pretty rare, to offer opening statements. And those were senior members, including the chairman of the Judiciary Committee on the Senate side, Mr. Grassley. And we saw the same thing happen on the House side, where Chairman Goodlatte came to the Senate hearing on EB-5. I think that interest is more an exercise to show that they're not done with the efforts to try to find a compromise. I would not be surprised moving forward if we see some additional EB-5 hearings, either in the House and Senate, prior to the August recess.
Hunter, does it make a difference when you are actually lobbying on the Hill as to whether you represent just a regional center, which would be one individual interest, as opposed to something like IIUSA, which is a huge trade industry body?
Well, I certainly think that consensus is really important to the members of Congress who are trying to tackle this issue. They themselves have to figure out how to find the sweet spot between urban interest and rural interest. So a trade association that represents both urban and rural interests can be a very valuable voice, because as difficult as it is to get consensus, to the extent that a trade association like IIUSA is able to achieve such a consensus, that means that their voice has a particularly strong resonance with those members of Congress who are trying to find just that, a consensus.
And just to echo what Hunter's saying, I think for members of Congress, it really does resonate when they understand that there's been an open and transparent and inclusive process that an industry group has gone through to come to that consensus, understanding it may not be universal.
Yeah,
That said, I think a number of members also like to hear directly from constituents and how pieces of legislation and certain provisions affect constituents within their states or within their districts.
Well, it's interesting because obviously a lot of us within the EB-5 industry who have things to say, we're not registered lobbyists, but is there anything that we can do?
Well, certainly contacting the offices are most interested in hearing from people from their district. And if your district happens to be one where there's an influential member of Congress on this particular issue, that's helpful. When that member that represents you may or may not be as involved in this issue, it makes it a little bit more difficult. But we always believe that the first and most important place for anyone to go to is someone who naturally shares their interest and of whom they are constituent. So I would say looking to your congressman or senator as your first place where you would reach out to.
Right. Well, gentlemen, there's no way you could be on the show without me asking you about the current state of play in DC and future outlook. And we always enjoy your anecdotes also. But please tell us, what is the current sentiment on the ground about EB-5 reform and immigration reform as a whole? Because there are so many conflicting stories that come out.
Well, as you know, Mona, there's been a real strong effort to try to come up with a consensus package. And a couple of years ago, we got very close. I would say if you were putting this in football terms, we probably got inside the 20-yard line on a consensus package a couple of years ago, but it fell short. And then what's happened over the last 9 months is that the House Judiciary Committee staff, the Senate Judiciary Committee staff, and Republican House and Senate leadership worked behind the scenes to try to come up with a proposal that would bring all the Republicans on board, with the goal of then taking that to the Democrats to see if they could get something done in the last large appropriations bill that passed back in February. That was the effort that took place. I think, again, using a football analogy, that effort got to the 5-yard line. They got very close to trying to find a consensus package, but ultimately ran out of time. And the consensus was not there as strongly as it needed to be.
I mean, would you put the blame on urban? I know that Senator Grassley did really blame certain regional centers from New York City in his little speech, but would you really blame the urban versus rural?
Well, I certainly don't think it's helpful to point fingers at this point. Obviously, Chairman Grassley has a very strong view and felt like that urban interest prevented it from getting over the goal line. I think if you talk to urban interests, they would argue that it didn't move enough in their direction. They might point the finger at rural interest. I don't think it's helpful to place blame as much as it is to say that the industry got very, very close to getting a package done this spring, and ultimately was not able to get there. And to get there, one of two things is going to happen. Either rural and urban come together around a package that they can truly live with and support strongly, or the regulations that DHS has been working on for well over a year now, that if those come out in a way that's acceptable, that could lead to being able to finalize a reauthorization package.
Mona, you brought up a good point about how do broader immigration debates play within EB-5. I think
Thank you.
during the last negotiation, the fact that there were unresolved issues related to DACA and funding for the border wall did not help other immigration provisions because Congress, from many members' perspective, wanted to deal with those issues first and foremost before they dealt with any other immigration issues.
Well, I think the only problem is with that is that many of investors just keep asking us, well, what has DACA got to do with immigration, with EB-5? Because EB-5 is so different and distinct from DACA and the border wall.
That's a good question. It's a fair question. But I think from many members' perspective, if anything immigration in any capacity is going to happen, they want to make sure that some of their priorities that are front and center from their constituents' perspective are given attention first, rather than other issues that may be considered, some members of Congress's mind, kind of second-tier immigration issues.
So it sounds like what you're saying is it could be that there's bipartisan agreement on EB-5. Maybe there's some consideration, some deals to be worked out, some understanding to be had between rural and urban parties and those interest groups. But it sounds like even within different senators and congressmen, they have their own key issues with regard to immigration as a whole. They want to put those priorities first and essentially pass those agendas or get their agendas addressed before even dealing with something that is more broadly agreed on, such as EB-5. Am I correct?
I think that's one way to put it. In an environment where there's very few legislative vehicles, and especially when those legislative vehicles are more focused on, funding the federal government, larger priorities, if there's anything to upset what could be a very delicate balance, I think Congress's first reaction is to put those off and to consider those later. And I think that's in part what happened with a number of these immigration measures, is that Congress decided that if they were to include any of these, it could disrupt that balance and they could not get this, as Hunter used some analogies, over the goal line from a federal funding perspective. So that's why I think you did not see anything significant related to DACA or to any border wall funding, as well as to anything EB-5 related.
Hunter, from an insider's perspective, how do you think we can actually achieve some kind of reform or change within EB-5, hopefully within 2018?
Well, Mona, that is really the question, and that's what everyone's trying to figure out. Between now and the November election, there are roughly about 14 legislative weeks where Congress will be in session, and it'll be very difficult to get things over the goal line between now and November. But I think one way on EB-5 that you could get something done is, first, if the industry can come together and get a stronger consensus position between urban and rural, I think there could be an opening if Congress ends up addressing DACA and the border wall funding later in the year.
When you're saying later in the year, are you talking about this September or perhaps after the midterm elections?
I think more than likely something this big is probably addressed after the election in the lame duck session in November, December, to have the groundwork laid with an agreement and a consensus package such that if there's a DACA border wall resolution in the lame duck session at the end of 2018, that you would be able to get included in that a reauthorization reform package on EB-5. One last thing I would say is the second way that you could potentially break the stalemate would be if USCIS follows through with the regulations they've proposed, then that could create an opening to resolve the other issues like the integrity reforms and a long-term reauthorization package. I think that you could see a scenario where if the investment levels are established by the regulations, that could resolve one of the most difficult issues, and then that could open the door to getting a reauthorization package done by the end of the year. So that would be the second route you might achieve reform in 2018.
Hans, when the current president came into office, we made a big deal that it was all about jobs, and EB-5 is all about jobs, and therefore he would support the whole EB-5 the way it is, really, perhaps, of course, with some reform. We don't see that. How much does the current administration also play into, what's going on in Congress?
I think the current immigration plays a very significant role in terms of what's going on in Congress, in particular as it relates to immigration. The president, when he was a candidate, made a lot of strong statements about immigration. He had a lot of strong views. EB-5 was not necessarily one of those. I do think he's also paying close attention to Congress's interest in the EB-5 program. This Congress, we've seen the chairman on the Senate side, Chairman Grassley, and the ranking member, Ms. Feinstein, actually introduce legislation to terminate the EB-5 program. We've also seen on the House side.
Hopefully that won't happen, though, right?
No, but it is a unique message that typically chairmen of the committees where they have jurisdiction over these issues don't offer these pieces of legislation. And typically they're not bipartisan either. And then on the House side, we saw the same piece of legislation offered by a senior member of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. King, as well. So I think the administration is aware that that type of legislation is pending. They're also aware of the regulations that are pending. They're also aware of the effort by the House and Senate chairmen, as well as the ranking members, as well as the interest by leadership to try to find a consensus agreement on legislation that can actually move forward. So I think they were trying to make sure they offered as much latitude and flexibility for members of Congress to try to move something. I think that they'll continue to do that. But as Hunter indicated, the DHS regulations are still pending, and it's something we're paying close attention to. And they could certainly be a trigger for more intense negotiations on the legislative side.
Thank you, Hans. But what is on the mind of a lot of the EB-5 stakeholders is, of course, additional visas. Do you see us getting additional visas into this program?
I think the question of additional visas will be a difficult one to get into any reform package. Of all the reform packages and of all the draft language that we've all seen, we've never seen any draft language that included additional visas for the program. That said, I think Congress could look at it also through the perspective of not necessarily adding more visas to the overall total, but looking at other visa pools where maybe they could reallocate those visas. That process will have its own challenges with Republicans and Democrats, depending on where those visas would be transferred from. And certainly Congress is well aware of the interest and the need for additional visas from the stakeholder community. And Mona, I know you asked earlier, what's something you can do?
I don't know if you recall, Hans, but our office did start a petition some time ago, maybe a year ago, and we were actually told off for that petition, asking Congress for additional visas.
Right. And I think if you ask some members of Congress for additional visas just to the overall total, it's somewhat of a difficult conversation. The administration certainly has not been pushing to raise the cap of overall immigrants coming into the country. I don't think you'll see them change that position. I don't think, frankly, you'll see the current chairman of either the House committee doing that.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Hans, a lot of people are looking at their own interests and the interests of essentially their constituents, whether that happens to be in a rural area or urban area. And I know there's a lot of back and forth on TEAs, what should the hurdle rates be? Who should have control of them? And it sounds like there's so much focus on that right now that the visa numbers really isn't something that folks want to pick up on, which is unfortunate.
I think that's an accurate assessment. I think Congress is focused on kind of tackling some of those bigger issues like investment amounts, TEA, the differential between the two price points for investors, and then maybe looking at issues like additional visas and additional capacity for the program.
Well, thank you so much. Akin, Gump, this has been great to have you on to talk about lobbying within EB-5. Hunter Bates, Hans Christopher Rickhoff, thank you so much for coming on EB-5 Investment Voice.
Thanks so much, Mona, and thanks for all you do.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. It's been our pleasure.
Thank you for being with us today on EB-5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shaw and Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's MSHAH law.com. Make sure you don't miss our next episode focusing on a different aspect of the EB-5 program by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB-5 Investment Voice.